Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 229. This is for our class for Monday, the 30th of September, where we are putting some closure onto Frankenstein and moving forward into Edgar Allan Poe. So, in terms of Frankenstein, I wanted to talk about the very iconic creation scene. We have to wait all the way until chapter 5 to get this scene. This was the nightmare that Mary Shelley had that evening of inclement weather when she was vacationing with Percy Shelley, her fiance at the time, and with some friends, and during some inclement weather, and that meant that they needed to stay indoors, and they challenged each other to ghost stories. And it was this scene that led to the iconic Frankenstein, probably one of the most famous Gothic texts that exists. It was a dreary night of November that I beheld the accomplishment of my toils. With an anxiety that almost amounted to agony, I collected the instruments of life around me, that I might infuse a spark of being into the lifeless thing that lay at my feet. It was already 1 in the morning. The rain pattered dismally against the panes, and my candle was nearly burnt out, when, by the glimmer of the half-extinguished light, I saw the dull yellow eye of the creation open. It breathed hard, and a convulsive motion agitated its limbs. How can I describe my emotions at this catastrophe, or how delineate the wretch with whom such infinite pains and care I had endeavored to form? His limbs were in proportion, and I had selected his features as beautiful. Beautiful! Great God! His yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of a lustrous black and flowing, his teeth of a pearly whiteness. But these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes, that seemed almost of the same color as the dun-white sockets in which they were set, his shriveled complexion and straight black lips. The different accidents of life are not so changeable as the feelings of human nature. I had worked hard for nearly 2 years for the sole purpose of infusing life into an inanimate body. For this I had deprived myself of rest and health. I desired it with an ardor that far exceeded moderation. But now that I had finished, the beauty of the dream vanished, and breathless horror and disgust filled my heart. Unable to endure the aspect of the being I had created, I rushed out of the room and continued a long time traversing my bedchamber, unable to compose my mind to sleep. At last, solitude or lassitude succeeded to the tumult I had endured, and I threw myself on the bed in my clothes, endeavoring to seek a few moments of forgetfulness. But it was in vain. I slept indeed, but I was disturbed by the wildest dreams. I thought I saw Elizabeth, in the bloom of health, walking in the streets. Delighted and surprised, I embraced her, but as I imprinted the first kiss on her lips, they became livid with the hue of death. Her features appeared to change, and I thought that I held the corpse of my dead mother in my arms. A shroud enveloped her form, and I saw the grave worms crawling in the folds of the flannel. I started from my sleep with horror. A cold dew covered my forehead. My teeth chattered, and every limb became convulsed, when, by the dim and yellow light of the moon, it was forced its way through the window shutters. As it forced its way through the window shutters, I beheld the wretch, the miserable monster whom I had created. He held up the curtain of the bed, and his eyes, if eyes they may be called, were fixed on mine. His jaws opened, and he muttered some inarticulate sounds while a grin wrinkled his cheeks. He might have spoken, but I did not hear. One hand was stretched out, seemingly to detain me, but I escaped and rushed downstairs. I took refuge in the courtyard belonging to the house which I inhabited, where I remained during the rest of the night, walking up and down in the greatest agitation, listening attentively, catching and fearing each sound, as if it were to announce the approach of the demoniacal corpse to which I had so miserably given life. No, no mortal could support the horror of that countenance. A mummy again endured with animation could not be so hideous as that wretch. I gazed on him while unfinished. He was ugly then, but when those muscles and joints were rendered capable of motion, it became a thing such as even Dante could not have perceived. there's so much that's going on in this particular passage. Certainly, there's the idea of the Gothic atmosphere. And we talked about how important that is. We talked about the appearance of the creature, which is similar yet different from expectation and Freud's theory of the uncanny, that which is familiar yet unfamiliar at the same time brings horror and anxiety. We talked about the idea of Victor's mother perhaps motivating his desire to create life from death. We talked about the foreshadowing that occurs in the novel, Victor's horrible nightmare about Elizabeth being turned into a corpse. We talked about the way that this text could be read as a condemnation of the male work ethic to the exclusion of anything and everyone, resulting in sickness and desolation and isolation. We talked about Victor and his vacillation, about how he talks about the creature was so beautiful, and yet he also talks about when he was creating the creature, it was ugly. And he seems to contradict himself throughout. So I use this as an example of the incredible writing that we see from Mary Shelley, who was just a teenager at the time, 19. And in fact, I have a short video for you to watch that it's only a minute and 51 seconds from USC, University of Southern California, and they were celebrating the 200th anniversary of this novel, which would have been in 2016, a novel that's never been out of print. So somehow it has captured the American imagination and probably the global imagination as well. But certainly we talked about the 1930s American Universal Studio Films movie genres and how Frankenstein, as well as other pieces such as Dracula, really helped to cement the idea of horror film. Now, as you know, your first paper will be due on the midpoint of the semester, in the midpoint of the semester, on the 23rd of October, but we are quickly moving into the 23rd, so I hope that at least at this point you are considering possibilities for your papers. It's a rolling deadline, so early papers encouraged. I certainly would encourage you to think about Frankenstein as an option for paper number 1. But as you know, we are also going to be transitioning into Poe short stories, and then finally Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde before that midpoint of the semester. And that Dracula would be after that, probably better suited for paper number 2. A critical paper, 4 to 5 pages, where I am using the Emily Dickinson quote as inspiration. One need not be a chamber to be haunted. And think about all of the different ways that Victor is haunted, and think about all the different ways that the creature is haunted. But you can create your own paper topic as long as it's based on one of the texts we are examining in class, and you approve your paper topic by me. And in the syllabus and other documents folder, you can find information about the paper, as well as what we talked about previously on how to write a critical paper. Now, if you'll remember, we began the semester with talking about Stephen King and also H.P. Lovecraft. And I wanted to return to Lovecraft because Lovecraft talked in his essay, Supernatural Horror in Literature, about his great respect for Edgar Allan Poe. According to Lovecraft, Poe was a vivid and detached chronicler of strangeness and gloom of the human mind, and was a master with creating the short stories maintenance of a single mood or impression. So thus far, we've been reading Mary Shelley, so that's a novel, and an epistolary novel at that. We talked about the complications. So it's a very different sort of animal reading a short story. And in fact, a little piece of trivia, Poe is often credited with creating the modern day detective short story. Certainly Poe had an understanding of abnormal psychology and was able to merge that with the possibility of supernatural horror. So we've talked about in the Gothic tradition that oftentimes what you have is an element of ambiguity that's involved, so that if you didn't want to accept a supernatural possible explanation, you could always you could always try to find something that's more naturalistic, which is something that we saw with Frankenstein. And Frankenstein straddles so many genres because certainly it's sci-fi about the possibilities of science and the dangers of science going unchecked. But as I argued, it also is gothic and horror in the sense that Victor is dealing with the cultists and with the dark arts. And when he talks about people like Cornelius Agrippa and the Philosopher's Stone. But that one of the reasons why Frankenstein is such a powerful novel is because it speaks to the idea of the other, that which is alien or different from ourselves, which is why I'm such a stickler that we not call the creature the monster, that the true monster is Victor or humanity as a whole for the rejection of this creature who really is quite benevolent. And the tabla rasa that the creature begins with, the blank slate, could even be said to veer towards benevolence because its first inclination is to embrace nature, to seek companionship, and to try to assist the DeLacy family. As the creature so eloquently states, that it learns evil through humanity. But I think we'll see the real evil of humanity, the psychological possibilities of evil in humanity through short stories from Edgar Allan Poe. In fact, Lovecraft had argued that Poe created the modern horror story in its final and perfected state, at least in terms up until the point that Lovecraft was writing. Now, Poe's biography is fascinating, probably just as fascinating as his writing. Definitely known for drug and alcohol issues, which you can see embedded within the text. He married his 13-year-old cousin, which would not have been that unusual during the time. We sort of talked about this with the idea of Victor and Elizabeth. While they weren't blood relations, they were raised as family members. In fact, he references her as cousin and sister at points in the novel. But this, of course, raises even more eyebrows that Poe would have married a blood relation. One of Poe's greatest fears was of being buried alive. That's definitely something that you can see in Poe's short stories. I mean, this was a literal fear. It was quite possible at the time that somebody could be prematurely buried. There was such a thing as a burial bell that would oftentimes be attached to a corpse. Let's say the corpse's toe or foot or a finger, so that if it turns out that a corpse had been buried prematurely, they could yank on the cord that would have been attached to the bell that would have been on the upper levels of the soil to alert individuals that they were buried alive. However, it also works so well in terms of a metaphor that the past always comes back to haunt you. You can't really bury anything. And that's the great thing about Poe, is that you can read him from an allegorical and a symbolic way. And the sense of the fear of the unknown, which we had talked a little bit about as perhaps the greatest fear, certainly that's what Lovecraft had argued, is something that we see with Poe examining the depths of the unknown of the human psyche and how dark it can indeed become. There is a short biography that I wanted you to watch of Edgar Allan Poe as well, and I have that in the third section of our notes. It was in the first section of our notes of Frankenstein where I had that short biography, or I should say that short 200-year anniversary video of about a minute and 51 seconds. And then it is in, actually, I've got things numbered incorrectly. I'm sorry. So Frankenstein is number 1, The Paper is number 2, Lovecraft on Poe is number 3, and 4. Section 4 is the section where I have the biography.com, the mini biography on Poe, 3 minutes and 49 seconds, so I don't think it's going to be too much of a stretch for you, in order to prepare us for his 4 short stories. The Fall of the House of Usher, and luckily I was able to provide links for those free links, as well as the page numbers of the text that I had ordered. The Fall of the House of Usher is probably the most challenging of the pieces, and definitely read from a symbolic perspective. The Mask of the Red Death, and if you know anything about The Shining and Stephen King, you can know that he references this Poe story, as well as other Poe stories as well in his writing. The Telltale Heart, which is very similar to The Black Cat. And oftentimes, these are the two short stories that are done at the high school level, where they are short enough so they can maintain audience attention. They are grotesque enough so they can also involve a certain level of interest, but not too grotesque. We're not going to get what Stephen King talks about with the gross out until we get to later texts. The Exorcist is the first thing that comes to my mind. And next class, we'll talk about the Poe stories in much more depth, as well as we will transition into Jekyll and Hyde. And Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, perhaps not as iconic as Frankenstein, but equally important in the Gothic tradition. And in fact, it is known as a novella, which means that it is longer than a short story. It's going to focus on more than one incident, but it's not as long as a novel, so it's not going to be as long as what we saw with Frankenstein. So we've got three different genres here from which you can write your first paper on. You can write about a novella, you can write about a short story, or short stories. You can perhaps compare and contrast. I would limit it to 2 short stories if you were going to write a paper on Poe. And of course, we also have the novel form, which we were exposed to with Frankenstein. Today's attendance question, before I started getting too much into Poe itself, was just about personal preference. So at this point, you should have finished Frankenstein, and ideally, you would have finished Edgar Allan Poe. If not, it's time to finish Edgar Allan Poe and begin reading Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The longest text of this semester will be Dracula, which follows Jekyll and Hyde. Good news is that we have a Halloween that straddles that, and I've often thought of Dracula as separate novels. So if you wanted to think of it as separate stories, I think it's much more digestible in terms of the length. Certainly, I think you'll find that it moves faster than Frankenstein moved. But out of the 4 Poe short stories that I have assigned, The Fall of the House of Usher, The Mask of the Red Death, The Telltale Heart, and The Black Cat, which did you prefer and why? And I tried to choose tales that had the possibility of a supernatural element as well as a naturalistic explanation, and tales that weren't too long, so that we could transition over into Jekyll and Hyde. So I'll leave you with watching the 2 videos that I had asked you to watch. The first being on the 200-year anniversary of Frankenstein, and that's from the University of Southern California. And the second being from biography.com, that's going to give you a mini Poe biography, talking a little bit about his life. In the next class, we can talk about the short stories themselves. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.